The day the company sent me the 50,000 yuan bonus, my mother dragged my father to my door. She was crying and shouting. She insisted that I hand over the money. My mother shouted, "I'm your real mother. I gave birth to you and raised you. You should respect me and give me the money." She wanted to save the money to pay for my medical treatment, so she left me alone in the hospital. She took the money and bought my younger brother a place in school. My father is the same as ever. It's as if this had nothing to do with him. You're joking. Who says that the one who gives birth to a child is necessarily the biological mother? Isn't the foster mother closer than the biological mother? In fact, the foster mother is the real mother. Ever since the company announced that the person with the best performance would receive a 50,000 bonus, I have been working continuously for almost half a year. Finally, I won first place by a narrow margin. The moment the bonus arrived in my account, I was so excited that my heart almost stopped. I ran excitedly back to Sophia's house. Sophia was clutching her chest, sitting on the sofa. Oliver's face was dark with anger. He was holding a broom and chasing the woman sitting on the floor, shouting. As soon as I entered the room, the woman who had been sitting on the floor cursing suddenly stood up. She grabbed my wrist. My mother pretended to wipe her eyes, but there were no tears there. She shouted, "Emma, it's me, your mother. Mom has been looking for you for ages. It's all that human trafficker's fault. He stole my precious little girl." I let go of her hand. I walk over to Sophia. I gently pat her back. "Mum." I was already 10 years old at the time. I wasn't a toddler. I could remember things. Dad, who was standing in the shadows, frowned. "Emma, how can you talk like that? We are your real parents. You've read so many books. Don't you know the basics of respect?" My mother was greatly encouraged by these words. She immediately stood up, pointed her finger at my nose, and scolded me loudly. "If I had known you were like this, I would never have let you live. What kind of attitude is that?" My mother raised her hand. Oliver quickly pulled me behind him. He stood in front of me like a hen protecting her chicks. I pulled Oliver over, lifted my head. "Waiting for him to strike," I said. "Go ahead, hit me. You're used to it anyway. Go ahead, kill me if you dare." My father jerked my mother away. His hand almost brushed my face. He said to her, "Don't forget why we're here. The money is the important thing. Liam's tuition fees are still outstanding." My mother stared at me. She held out her hand and said, "Give me the money. We haven't seen each other for so many years. It's time you showed some respect. 200,000. 200,000. I don't have that kind of money. I'll come and get the money tomorrow. Or I'll tell everyone how Sophia, who has been teaching for years, has abducted a child." Oliver's eyes are red. He waves the broom and drives the two of them out the door. My father doesn't say a word. He takes my mother, who is still shouting at the door, by the hand, and they go reluctantly. Sophia takes me in her arms. My eyes were also red. I sobbed quietly. Oliver's eyes were red. He patted my shoulder gently. The crying gradually grew louder. Sophia looked at me. Her eyes were full of pity. In the middle of the night, I went to the bathroom. I found the light in Sophia's room still on. I heard a low voice from inside. "Oliver, tomorrow you take Emma out to avoid it for a while. Her mother won't let her go easily." "Mom, didn't you say before that Emma was just staying with us temporarily? What's going on now?" Sophia waves her hand. She sighs. "Sigh. Let bygones be bygones. Your mother knows you two are close. You must treat Emma well. She's had a hard life." I stand in the doorway. Tears flow unstoppably down my face. Watching Sophia worry about me, her hair has gone gray. He even gave up the chance of a promotion just to grow up with Oliver and me. I thought of my mother again. "Mother, did you really not love me? Am I not a part of you? Mother, did you really not love me?" Emma, that was my name once. Her name, so insignificant, so humble that it was almost invisible. Even this name, it was given to her younger brother when I was born. My grandmother saw that I was a girl and didn't give me a name. She took my father away from the hospital. My mother, who had difficulty moving, and I, who was crying from hunger, were left behind. My grandmother, who pitied my mother, took me home with her. I never had a name. My grandmother always called me girl. That was until I was 4 years old. My mother came to get me back. This was my grandmother's idea. Having a child at home would attract good luck. It would be easy to have a son. My grandmother thought the name Emma was good. She said, "The more common the name of a girl, the more likely she is to attract a son." The first year I was home, my grandmother was no longer there to rock me in the fan-shaped fan. I often woke up crying in the middle of the night. The first time I felt scared, I wrapped myself in the quilt and knocked on my mother's door. My parents were still asleep. My grandmother grabbed my ear in a daze and covered my mouth. She pulled me back into the room. She sternly warned me and not to disturb my parents while they were having a son. As a small child, I didn't understand what had happened. The next day, I ran to tell my mother. I wanted to be like other children. I threw myself into her arms and pouted. But she pushed me away. I fell to the ground. My mother said angrily, "Why aren't you a boy?" Looking at her angry face, I was scared and cried. My mother angrily grabbed my hand and pushed me out the door. I cried and pounded on the door. I kept shouting, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." It was quiet inside the door. Not a sound. I was too tired to cry anymore, so I just lay down on the mat by the door. And I thought to myself that my grandmother had lied to me. She had said that no mother could ever stop caring for her child until I was 6 years old. Every night, the only company I had was the creaky door in the hallway and the light above my head, which sometimes flickered on and off. Oliver's role in my life was like my grandmother when I was little. Only my grandmother didn't last. My grandmother came to visit me in secret. She held me in her arms and rocked me gently as she used to do. "My dear, don't be afraid. If you're good, Mummy will love you." She wiped away the tears from the corner of her eyes. That night, I stood outside the door and saw my normally patient grandmother arguing with my mother, insisting that she take me home with her. My mother shouted that Grandma didn't understand. In the end, Grandma couldn't convince my mother. After all, no mother can refuse her child. When Grandma left, she slipped the only 5 yuan she had into my hand. Then she staggered off. I hid the money carefully. I figured that if I saved up to 10 yuan, I could buy a ticket to go back to Grandma's. A ticket costs exactly 10 yuan. When my mother was in a good mood, would take me out for a walk. I loved it when my mother held my hand. Who wouldn't love their mother? When I got home, my father had a long face. Grandma gave me a stern look. He was clutching the 5 yuan I had hidden under my pillow. My father waved his hand. He knocked my mother to the ground. He kept saying nasty things. "Beat her, beat her. You're so unlucky to have given birth to me. And you stole money. You're not learning good habits at such a young age. Your mother is no good either." Grandma was still there, adding fuel to the fire. I cried and hugged my father's leg. My father kicked me away with one kick. "Grandma gave it to you. Grandma gave it to you," he shouted, while punching my mother over and over with his fists. Stop it, James, James. I gave birth to your son. I gave birth to your son. Stop it, please. Mom, help me." My father was tired of hitting. He turned around and went into the bedroom, panting heavily. After a while, the snoring got louder and louder. Grandma was still there, sneering. "If you can't give birth to a son, I'll let James beat you up. And then, I'll let him beat up this girl you gave birth to and feed her to the pigs. At such a young age, you're already full of lies." He spat at my mom. I crawl over to my mother. I hug her tightly. My mother turns her head. She looks at me with hatred in her eyes. It makes my heart ache. She stands up. She grabs the broom nearby. She swings it at me. "It's all your fault. It's all your fault. Why weren't you a boy? Why haven't you brought me a brother? I'll beat you." I'm scared and confused. Is this really my fault? Have I not been obedient enough? I cry and hide. But my mother is even angrier. And the beating gets even worse. I curl up, hoping the nightmare will end tonight. I haven't quite woken up yet when I hear the knock on the door. And then my mother's loud scolding. I hurry out and slam the door behind me, standing in the doorway. My mother sees me come out and keeps on scolding. But she turned her anger on me. "Where's the money? Hand it over. Don't play dumb. I know exactly you can hide from people, but you can't hide from things." She leaned in close to my ear and whispered, "Aren't you getting married? Give me the money. I'll stop. Otherwise, you'll never get married." My mother sat down directly in the hallway and started to cry and scream, which attracted the neighbors to come and watch the show. Seeing the crowd, Mom put on an even better show. My daughter has never been sensible since she was young. Seeing that our family was poor, she left my father and me and went off with a rich man. I had a hard time finding her. She said she would never recognize me as her mother again. My life is really miserable. Mom, you probably really don't understand me. When I was on my knees fighting with stray dogs for a bun, I understood. Only those who can let go of their pride can live a better life. Mom looked at me with a face of disbelief. Suddenly, she became emotional. She charged at me. She completely forgot the desperate look she had just now when she was looking for her daughter. Just as her hand was about to hit my face, I let my face come naturally closer to hers. Then I deliberately fell to the ground. She trembled all over. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at her mother. With a quavering voice, she said, Mom, I was wrong. Please don't hit me anymore. Mom, I'll go home with you. I'll do as you say. Please don't hit me anymore, please. And with that, I rolled up my sleeve. The neighbors couldn't stop talking. They pointed at my mother. My mother panicked. She waved her hands. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. She did this to herself. You're lying. You're accusing me falsely. Neighbor Auntie Smith could no longer stand it. She shouted at my mother. What kind of mother hits her own child like that? You've gone too far, she finished. He helped me up from the floor. That's right. That's right. What kind of mother calls her own daughter names like that? She doesn't seem like a nice person. I leaned on Auntie Smith's shoulder. I watched my mother fluster. Last night was not in vain. Mom, isn't it your favorite thing to see me bow to you? Don't blame your mother. She really is very good to me. She just accidentally forgot me at the old house when we moved. Your mother still loves me. Auntie Smith's eyes were filled with tears. She patted my back gently. She said, you child, how could your mother forget you? This child really makes people feel sad. This mother really makes people speechless. She abandoned her child in the first place. Now that the child is doing well, she wants to come back to find her child. When my mother heard these words, her face turned ugly, seeing that the situation could not be changed. A boy wearing a cap pulled his mother. The two quickly left. When he turned his head, the eyes under the brim of the cap stared at me coldly. I looked at him carefully and found that his eyebrows and eyes looked a lot like mine. I suddenly understood. It turned out to be my younger brother. I took the day off to calm down at home. Afterwards, I went to work as usual. As soon as I entered the office, the cleaning lady, who was usually so friendly with me, walked away from me. My colleagues around me also pointed at me. Everyone looked at me with a sense of fun in their eyes. What's more, when someone walked past me, they would deliberately bump into my chair. Then they walked away without looking back. Just when I was about to lose my temper, my supervisor, Emtikes Johnson, came to talk to me. Emma, I hired you. I appreciate your work. But you need to understand, as an adult, you should value your reputation. Take responsibility for your actions. Before she could finish, my mother suddenly pushed open the door. The security guard next to her looked a little embarrassed. He said to Emtikes Johnson, I'm sorry. I really couldn't stop her. My mother gave a smug look. She straightened the faded laundry. She pulled a chair over. She sat down next to me. Emtikes Johnson, as you know, I'm not in the best of health. The father of my child doesn't contribute to the household. She has a younger brother. Money is needed for everything. My daughter left our home. She went with someone else. I really had no choice. We have to make a living. She refuses to acknowledge me. She dislikes the fact that we are poor, but she is still my biological child. Mum pretended to wipe away a tear from the corner of her eye. Then she shook my hand. I quickly pulled my hand back. I stood up and looked at Emtikes Johnson. She looked disapproving. I said to her, Madam, don't worry, I will take care of this. Sorry for the trouble. I bowed deeply. Mum saw me walk out of the office. She hurriedly followed. She saw that I was about to leave the office area. Worried that she would not be able to use public opinion to force me to comply, she quickly grabbed my clothes. Colleagues sitting in their respective positions also stuck their necks out. They watched the situation here intently. Seeing that the audience was all here, my mother directly sat on the ground and cried out. She said, My daughter has always loved to play with boys since she was young. She left with someone at a young age. I had a hard time finding her. She doesn't recognize me. She doesn't recognize me as her mother. What have I done wrong? I kneel in front of my mother. I turn on the speaker on my phone. The recording plays back my mother's loud shouts and harsh words, and her demand for 200,000 yuan. I look up. My eyes are full of tears. Mom, you've been saying this about me since I was little. Isn't that enough? Mom, I'm sorry, I really don't have any money left. Mom, I've already given you all the money I have. Mom, I'll work hard to earn money, please. I rubbed my hands together. A sincere plea. Oliver hurried over with a lawyer. He helped me up. He took me in his arms. He looked down at my mother. The lawyer next to him immediately opened the contract in his hands. Emtikes Johnson, we are here this time because you and your husband abandoned your biological daughter 15 years ago. Emma's fiancé square copyright, Mr. Oliver, has instructed us to sue you. Here is the lawsuit. Please take a look. We will formally file the lawsuit with the court at the appropriate time. Mom slammed the lawsuit out of the lawyer's hand. Angrily said, Just go. No child sues their parents, Emma. You're something, just you wait and see. Mom quickly got up, panicked and left, seeing that I hadn't been able to bring a grandchild home for several years. Grandma started looking everywhere for all kinds of folk remedies. She made my mother drink it. Today it was a black medicine. Tomorrow it will be burnt talismans. My mother's mood got worse and worse. She beat me every other day. As a result, I couldn't go to school. My class teacher Sophia saw that I kept asking for leave. So she and some other teachers came to my house to check on the situation. Sophia opened the door. At a glance, she saw that I was full of tears. I was crying so hard that my whole body was shaking. My mother was holding a bent clothes hanger in her hand. Sophia couldn't bear to look any longer. She found an excuse and hurriedly left. The next day, Sophia called me into her office for questioning. I was scared. I said, "My mother just has a bad temper, but she's still very good to me." Grandma told me, "As long as I'm obedient, my mother will like me." Sophia hugged me tightly. Her tears wet my back. From that day on, Sophia made me stay at school 2 hours longer every day than the other students. During those 2 hours, I felt especially happy. Sophia took care of me like a mother. She combed my hair, wiped my face, laughed and talked with me, and seriously tutored me in my studies. At that time, I thought to myself, if only Sophia were my mother, but I wasn't that lucky. Good fortune wouldn't always follow me. Less than 2 years later, Sophia was transferred to teach in another city. On the day Sophia left, she gave me a long hug. Then she handed me a note with her contact details. She said that if I ever called, she would come and get me. From then on, every night when I had trouble sleeping, I would count the numbers in my head to get through the night. Later, Grandma left alone. Grandma couldn't bear to spend the 10 yuan bus fare. I never got to see Grandma for the last time. Later, Grandma passed away on a cold winter night. When she collapsed, her body fell heavily to the ground. She looked lifeless. After Grandma died, my mother stopped insisting that I be born a son. Instead, she started paying more attention to me. She took pride in my academic performance. My mother didn't think 98 points was good enough. Only a perfect score was acceptable. I took the test with the 98 points and my mother sat angrily in her chair. She scolded me loudly. "How could you be so stupid? You got the answer wrong on such an easy question." My mother pulled me to the table. My head hit the corner of the table. It hurt so much that my face changed color. I held back my tears, but my mother didn't seem to notice at all. She pressed my head again and again. She made me look at the test paper. My hand holding the pen shook involuntarily. I accidentally drew a line on the test paper. My mother suddenly became angry and snatched the pen, poking it into my hand. "Who are you giving attitude to? Was I wrong to give birth to you? If you weren't so lazy, your father wouldn't have to go away." I covered my hand and held back the tears. I knew if I cried today, I'd have to suffer again tonight. That little wound slowly healed over time, leaving only a small black spot. However, those painful feelings still crept up on countless dark nights. But those days didn't last long. Soon after, Mum became pregnant. Dad had been coming home more often lately. Mum often knelt on the mat, praying for a boy. I wished for that too. A little brother would be nice. A sister would probably get beaten too. The day my brother was born, Dad was so excited until the nurse came out and told him to be quiet. He shouted, "We, the Smiths, finally have an heir. We can't let the Smith name die out." When my brother came home like me, he cried nonstop in the middle of the night. My mother held him in her arms and hummed a lullaby. Her face was beaming with tenderness. I stood outside the door and peeked through the crack, watching this heartwarming scene. As my brother grew up, life at home became more and more difficult, but my mother always saved the best for my brother. My father still rarely came home. Men are really unpredictable. He always wanted a son, but after he had one, he didn't come home anymore. He hung around all day. My mother went from place to place. She tried every way to persuade my father to come home. My brother and I were all alone at home. I was really happy. My brother was so small, soft and squishy. His eyes blinked. He looked at me with a smile. My grandmother at that time must have been just like me. She was full of expectations for the future. Too, I often took care of my younger brother while busy washing vegetables and cooking. One time, I wasn't paying attention. My brother accidentally knocked over the kettle full of hot water. I immediately rushed over. I used my body to block him. I protected him behind my back. As a result, my brother only got a small blister the size of a soybean from the scalding. I got scalded by the boiling water on my back. My mother screamed. She quickly ran into the house, picked up her brother, and hurriedly rushed to the hospital. Before she left, she gave me a kick. She blamed me for not taking care of my brother. I looked at my mother's hurriedly departing back. I couldn't help but cry out, "Mom, I'm in pain. Mom, she didn't even turn around in the end. It was my cries that alerted the neighbor, Auntie Smith. She quickly took me to the hospital. That was the most unforgettable Christmas in my memory. The windows were hung with lights. There was a festive atmosphere everywhere, but my parents and brother had left my life without a trace. Outside the window was a sea of red. Every household was enjoying the joy of reunion. I was the only one lying in an empty hospital room, begging the hospital not to give up on me. Later, I went back to look for them. My neighbor Auntie Smith told me, "Your mother said that this place is always full of accidents. It's unlucky you got burned so badly. And your family doesn't have the money to treat you. They just decided to forget you were born. They took your brother and went to the next city to look for your father." I had been holding onto a glimmer of hope, but at that moment I was completely orphaned. To survive, I dialed the phone number I had memorized. When Sophia answered the phone, she was taken aback. She remembered the day I stood in the window, covered in red welts, with a bent hanger and a test paper soaked in tears at my feet. She came over immediately and gave me a new home. At first, Oliver hated me in particular for suddenly moving into their home, despite Sophia's repeated requests that he take good care of me. He was still resentful towards me. He felt that I had taken away my mother's love and attracted all of her attention in class. He always deliberately pulled my pigtail, tugged at my skirt, and drew a piglet behind my back. I saw Sophia's worried eyes. I looked up and smiled. I told her not to worry. The next day, I cut my hair short and stopped wearing skirts as the days passed. Oliver gradually changed from initially hating me and never going to school with me to offering to carry my school bag every day and waiting for me at school. Oliver's change was sudden. Sophia asked him privately. Oliver just answered awkwardly. She is my younger sister, after all. Of course a brother has to look after his sister. I suddenly remembered that day at the street corner. I was standing there with tears streaming down my face, blocking the way of the mother who was scolding her child. Around the corner, Oliver was standing there. She didn't like me on the surface, but she always secretly waited for me to come home. As we grew up slowly, the atmosphere between us became a little more subtle. Even Sophia felt it, but she kept pretending not to know, until one day, we confessed everything to Sophia. She just cried and hugged me tightly. She told me, "The days ahead will definitely get better and better. I have always believed that I am lucky, because in the future, I will have Sophia and Oliver by my side." Sophia once comforted me. I have never been able to let go of the feeling of being abandoned, but I have a lot of fond memories of that little, soft brother. Liam, at that time, he was just a child. What could he decide? But he forgot that he had been raised by such a couple. That day, he suddenly appeared downstairs at my company. He took my hand. I was even filled with the hope of long-lost affection. I took his phone. I saved my number in it. I took him out to eat something delicious. I bought him new clothes. When he tentatively asked about my salary and bonuses, I told him without reservation. I promised him, when the bonus came out this time, I would take him out to eat something good. Mom's family suddenly became quiet for a while after this incident. I felt something was wrong. I remembered Liam's eyes that day. I felt like something was about to happen. Liam, who always waited for me at the door after work, sweetly called me sister. It seemed to be just my imagination. Oliver was afraid that my mom and her family would disturb me again, so he insisted on driving me to and from work every day. I laughed at him for being so nervous, but he insisted on driving me every day, no matter the weather. Then he caught a bad cold. His voice was hoarse as he reminded me to be careful on the way. He also told me to call him when I reached the alley near my home. I sneaked into the alley. I felt an uncomfortable gaze on my back. I unconsciously quickened my pace. The person following me also quickly ran up. "Stop!" The sharp tip of a knife pressed against my back. A strong arm tightly encircled my neck. I hear rapid breathing. My whole body is tense. Liam said his sister was beautiful and rich. Now it seems that's true. I shift slightly. A rough hand grabs my waist. The tip of the knife presses forward a little more. "Don't move," he says. "Take your nude photos. $1,000 per photo, just do me a favor," he finishes. He grabs my hair and pulls me into the darker area. When Oliver arrived, I was sitting against the wall. I was clutching a bloody stone in my hand. The man had already fled. Oliver took me. I still looked a little dazed. We went to the police station to report the incident. On the way home, I leaned on Oliver's shoulder. Oliver said, "Emma, even the name seems so insignificant, unremarkable. Emma is not humble. Her micro the loneliness of a fallen flower. the micro rain and the micro flying together. The night was pitch black, but Oliver's eyes were shining. 3 days later, the police station sent news. The person had been caught. He also confessed to the mastermind behind it. That person was my younger brother, Liam. The day Liam was locked up, I stood there. I saw his mother crying and pulling him. His father stood by, without saying a word, just smoking nonstop. At that moment, I suddenly remembered something. The day Grandma left, I probably held my mother just like that, wanting a ticket home. My mother stood nearby, looking at me expressionlessly. Suddenly, her eyes lit up. She grabbed my clothes. "Emma, you must tell the police. Your brother is innocent. You did it willingly. You must say something. Emma, for your father's sake, give your brother a chance." Oliver pushed his mother's hand away. He separated me from my mother. "Dad, you think that's a way to talk to someone? How can you say such things?" I looked straight at my father. His body was getting worse due to smoking and drinking. His face was pale. I could no longer find the look he had when he hit me before. "Didn't you tell my mother that I wouldn't live long when you were on the phone that night?" I wasn't even asleep yet. "If I hadn't fainted that day, wouldn't you have drugged me too and left me there? You're no better. Don't pretend to be innocent. Ever since I was little, I've been telling my brother, everything I have is his. You're talking to me like that." My father was caught off guard. He trembled with anger, but he still wanted to be like before. He tried to maintain his authority as a father by slapping me. He charged at me and suddenly fell. I watched this scene in front of me. I felt a little funny. I turned around easily, pulled Oliver, and walked forward in big strides. He completely ignored my mother's anxious shouts from behind. James, are you okay?" When I saw my mother again, she looked much older. Her hair was completely white. It was as if she had suddenly aged a dozen years. She knelt in front of me, begging, "Mom, please go and explain to the police. Liam is Mommy's heart's treasure. How can you be so heartless and take away Mommy's baby? Mommy, I beg you. Mommy is kneeling before you. Mommy is bowing to you. I can no longer hide my anger. Squat down. Look directly into Mommy's face. Mommy, how can Liam be so shameless? Ever since he appeared, whatever he wants, I give it to him. But even so, he still doesn't know how to be grateful. What an ungrateful person." Mom avoided eye contact and said, "You haven't suffered either, have you? Liam is still young. Can't you just give him a chance?" "My child, would a child come up with such a scheme, Mom? Instead of this, why don't you find Liam a good lawyer? He's still young." Mom tugged on my clothes. Seeing that I didn't respond and slapped me. "I worked so hard to raise you. Is this how you repay me? I should have kept a tighter rein on you. You're a disgrace. You're a burden." She cried and cursed at me. My mouth twitched. The pain in my cheek made me frown. "Mum, is that all you've got? You're just like when I was little. You hurt my pride for no reason. You knew I didn't take the stuff from the tuck shop that time, but you still insisted that I was a thief. You made me kneel in front of the tuck shop. The sun was shining that day, but I felt cold all over. I always thought, if I'm just a bit more obedient, you'll love me. But then you showed up, and I really understood. You don't really love me. You hit me again and again, just to show your authority as a mother." Mum looked at me with such anger in her eyes. I suddenly realized that my hatred for her was real. Not only that, I also deeply hated everyone in this family. After that fight that day, Dad, who was already in poor health, couldn't hold on anymore. He was admitted to the hospital. Mum, who was already busy with Liam, now had to take care of Dad as well. She was no longer as gentle as before. When taking care of Dad, she looked impatient and disgusted. Oliver asked around. Finally, he found out which hospital his father was in. I also specially notified my father's creditors. This is a time for the whole family to be reunited. How can I be absent as a child? Couldn't I go to my father's bedside to show my filial piety on the day I went to the hospital? I politely declined Oliver's kind offer to accompany me. He was such a sunny and cheerful person. How could he be affected by this gloomy atmosphere? When my father woke up, he saw me sitting next to him, crossing my legs and not paying any attention. He reached out his hand and pointed at me, trembling. I slapped his hand away directly. "Don't point at me." I took out my phone in front of Dad. "Dad, I've deliberately kept this video for many years. I wanted to surprise you with it. What's playing on the video is the scene on the day Grandma died. Grandma and Mum had an argument for some reason. The atmosphere became more and more tense. In the end, they even started pushing each other. Mum accidentally pushed Grandma to the ground. Unexpectedly, Grandma's back of the head hit a protruding stone. Immediately, there was unstoppable bleeding. In a panic, Mom left her injured grandmother behind. She fled. In the video, Grandma reaches out in the direction Mom left. Her hand gradually falls, her breathing stops. I press pause. I smile at Dad, who is full of grief and anger. I reach out and touch his face. I say, "Dad, you never thought that Grandma died because of Mom, did you? Watching you and Mom work together was particularly gratifying. If Grandma knew that you had lived with the person who caused her death for so many years, I'm afraid she would be very sad." Looking at my father's reddened eyes, I understood. After all these years, the mask he had been pretending to wear could no longer be worn. A habitual abuser. How could he change just because he had a child? Later, I saw the news about my parents on the social news. At that time, my father lost control of his emotions. He dragged my dying mother to the edge of the roof. Surrounded by police and firefighters, they were trying to talk him down. He looked dazed. The anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "Mom, let this woman go down and apologize to you," he said, raising his hand. Like throwing a rag, he threw Mom off the roof. Just then, a breeze came along. The wind caught Dad, who was unsteady on his feet, and swept him off too. In an instant, the two of them were in each other's arms. Even the forensic doctor had a hard time separating them. I watched the images on TV. I laughed so hard I had tears in my eyes. And there was one more, the last one. Liam was behind it all, but he didn't actually hurt me. A few days later, he was released from custody. I was standing outside the door when I saw Liam coming at me angrily, but halfway there, he was taken away by the police and brought back to the station. I waved the phone in my hand. Liam suddenly understood and flew into a rage. He tried desperately to break free from the police officer's grip. He shouted, "Emma, you bastard, you damned person. I'll never let you go. I'll deal with you." Liam was eventually sentenced to prison for intentional assault. Before I started working here, I had looked up the family, by chance. I heard that Liam had been expelled from school for bullying, but since there was no conclusive evidence, Liam was not held responsible. To my surprise, Liam's mobile phone contained a video of the bullying incident. As soon as I entered the mobile phone number, I uploaded the video to my cloud drive. Even without that incident, Liam would have had to face the consequences of his actions sooner or later. Shortly afterwards, I heard that Liam had gotten into a fight in prison. He was stabbed in the lung with a sharpened toothbrush. Before the ambulance arrived, he was already out of breath. From that day on, I truly felt completely free, no longer bound by any chains or suffering. I threw Liam's photo into the burning brazier in front of me. The breeze lifted the drifting ashes. The flickering firelight reflected on my face. "I know you can't let go of your son, so I've let him go to be with you." Mom and Dad. Dad. I forgot to mention that I was also there that day when Grandma, I was there too. She was actually asking for help. I turned around without hesitation and walked away. I saw Oliver waiting for me not far away. Suddenly, I remembered that night in primary school. I pretended to be asleep with my eyes closed. Oliver squeezed through the door, crouched down by my bed, and gently tucked the corners of the quilt with her little hands. He said firmly, "I will never let anyone bully you again." I quickly ran to him and threw myself into his open arms. The teacher was right. The next few days were going to be great.